Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everybody. It's beautiful to be here. I'm usually here for Jummah on Fridays, so I'm really blessed to be able to be here delivering a lecture to you all. It was a very kind introduction as well. Just before we begin, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Bismillah. So I think Imam Shakil spoke well in terms of the different views that people have on Black history within having it constrained to a month. And as I said, I think this is a very good opportunity. Black History Month is a very good opportunity to be able to start that conversation and then to expand it out. So I'm going to go through a few things today. When I was asked to speak, I picked this particular thing because I think Black Muslims in Britain, there seems to be, well, I feel like it's sometimes quite a difficult thing to be, because there is so much going on. There's so many different things that are pulling on your identity in different ways, and it can be hard at times to know what direction to take and what things to do. So I wanted to give an understanding to people that Black people are inherent in the religion and the faith of Islam, and to also show some examples of Black prophets, or prophets that could be described as Black today, and Black companions as well, and then to look at some cultural and political issues, and then looking into how we sort of navigate the issue of racism today from an Islamic perspective. Can I get a bit of water as well? Okay, so first of all, I usually like to set the scene and to set the vision with some hadiths and verses. So one of the most important ones, I think, when we're looking at the issue of racism, anti-Blackness, and just general social injustice, is Surah An-Nisa, where it says, "O you have believed, be persistently standing firm in justice, witnesses for Allah, even if it be against yourselves or parents and relatives. Whether one is rich or poor, Allah is more worthy of both. So follow not personal inclination, lest you not be just. And if you distort your testimony or refuse to give it, then indeed Allah is ever with what you do acquainted." I think this is very, very important, as I said, because it puts the commandment and it puts the expectation on us as Muslims to seek justice. And again, this justice is very important. It's from the lens of our faith, it's from the parameters of our faith, and within the principles of our faith as well. Sorry, just give me 1 second. The next one is a verse from Surah Al-Hujurat, and I think it's very important because often something I hear when we're speaking about racism or Blackness, all these kind of things, is there is no Blackness in Islam, or Islam shouldn't see color, or Islam doesn't see color. And I would say this verse from the Quran actually disagrees with that, in that, so I'll read it out. It's verse 13. "O humanity, indeed we created you from male and female, and made you into peoples and tribes so that you may get to know one another. Surely the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous among you. Allah is truly all-knowing and all-aware." So if Islam was colorblind, or we were supposed to be colorblind, why is it we were created in different colors, shades? Why did we come from different nations, ethnicities, tribes, all of these things? These things are deliberate. It's deliberate these things were done. However, we have these differences, and I think it's important to recognize these differences. We don't need to suppress them, and we can celebrate them as well. The lens which we should look at that from, I'm going to come to next. So Allah Most High has removed from you the pride of, this is a hadith from Sunan Abu Dawood. Allah Most High has removed from you the pride of the pre-Islamic period and boasting in its ancestors. One is only a pious believer or a miserable sinner. You are sons of Adam, and Adam came from dust. Let the people cease to boast about their ancestors. The hadith goes on. So, like I said, it's very important that we recognize that there are differences between us, and we should celebrate those differences. I don't think we should erase them from existence or say that we don't see them. However, the most important labels to us as believers should be the things we're going to be judged by at the end of the day is, are we pious believers or are we miserable sinners, essentially? And that's where all of these identities, all of these tribes and nations that we come from, that is the converging point of everything that we as Muslims occupy. So when we look at Black British Muslim identity, there's nothing wrong with celebrating these things. However, the converging point and the central point of those identities needs to be the fact that I think sometimes people have a problem, maybe swallowing this in that, why do I need to choose between, being one thing and another? I don't think it's about choosing, but as Muslims, we should always remember whether we're looking at from a racial lens or a cultural lens, Islam always comes first. So the converging point for all of those identities, Black, British, Muslim, is the Muslim part. The Muslim part, the Islamic part, is the part which we use to filter out negative aspects of culture or politics, whatever it may be. There's another hadith which is from the Prophet ﷺ's last sermon, and it says, "O people, your Lord is one, and your father Adam is one. There is no superiority of an Arab over a non-Arab, nor over a non-Arab over an Arab, and neither white skin over black skin and black skin over white skin, except by piety." So when I sort of reflected on this hadith, one thing that made me realize is somebody who's pious doesn't look at others and say, I am superior to them, or this person is superior to me. They don't think about those things. Their focus is Allah, right? And so if somebody truly is able to reach that station of piety, they become superior over others, but they don't recognize that they're superior over others. So it's kind of paradoxical. So many people may fight over the fact, okay, I'm an Arab and you're not an Arab, or I have this color skin and you don't have this color skin. However, when one reaches a point where, again, they can transcend these things don't leave them. Again, we still have these physical characteristics, we still have a culture and our background. However, when one reaches the level of transcending these things, reaching that level of piety, they don't see people as being superior because of your skin color, or because you're an Arab or you're not an Arab. And they themselves will actually become superior to others because they have reached that level of piety, but they won't even see it in themselves. And I think that's quite, I think it's really beautiful, subhanAllah, when I reflect on that. So that's just to set the scene. So what does it mean to be black? I might actually ask some of you what your thoughts are, brothers and sisters. Some of you, just when you hear the word black, what does it mean to you? Anybody? No one? No one has anything?
Originally from Africa.
Originally from Africa, okay. Cool. Anybody else? No one else thinks of anything when they hear the word black.
People have different, when it first started to be used, had a different meaning to it.
Yeah.
Today it might mean your African, your heritage African or Caribbean. Is it the color of your skin? Sometimes somebody can be mixed race, but they might say black.
Yes.
So there's a whole kind of like social construct within the term black itself.
Yeah. No, 100%. You've already said the parts I was going to say, mashallah. So it's true, when we look at black, originally the term when used on people was used often with a negative connotation. However, words and concepts go through changes over time, right? And so I'd be somebody who'd be classified as being black, whereas if you look at my skin, it's actually brown. So how did we come to this point of the label of black coming about, right? And as you said, another brother said, originally being from the African continent, some people would say it's, being from the Caribbean. The truth is, to find a blanket definition will be quite difficult, but generally people refer to it as being people from African descent. In the UK, you'll hear the words of Black British or Black African, Black Caribbean. If you go to America, you'll see African American being used. And there's different reasons for why these terms have come about. When we look at slavery, when black people were taken by force mostly from the West African region, but all over Africa. When they were taken and shipped around the world, most of them were shipped to Brazil. Many of them, the next was then America, then South America. They were also, many of them shipped to Europe and South Asia, and Australia as well. So you can imagine if you take a group of people, let's say, all of us in South London are put in different parts of the world, right? And you can say there's a sort of South London culture, right, we all have between us. When you spread out people between different places, that creates different subsets of that culture. And that's essentially what happened. African culture, in terms of West African and the rest of the people that were enslaved, when they were taken to other places, they didn't just leave their roots behind, they took it with them and also merged with the culture or the place that they were put in. And this is essentially what's happened to black people, and it's caused a very large proliferation of what it means to be black or what black is described. You've got Afro-Brazilian, you've got African American, and even within African American, you find that they're called African Americans because they can't. Many of them, they may be 10th generation black people. So if you go 10 generations back, that's when you find the ancestors who were enslaved came here. So they may actually not know where they came from originally, so they call them Africans, just the general continent. In the UK, it's Black British, but wherever you go, black is usually the term that brings people together. So it's a sort of political unifying term, a social unifying term, or a cultural unifying term. So it has different meanings in that sense. And I have spoken to some Muslims who may say, why is it black Muslims and not, African Muslims? And again, I try and give this kind of answer so people understand the reason why this term has come about. I know some black people in the UK who they prefer being called black or black British because they don't really connect with their indigenous culture. They don't know much about their indigenous culture. So black as a term is something that allows them to understand and to connect with their roots as well, and it describes their experience in the UK. So the next thing I sort of want to go over, I think is really important, even when I was reading over these things, it was very insightful for me to understand that we have prophets, may peace be upon them, and we have companions, may Allah be pleased with them, who would actually be described as black today, or actually described as black in traditional sort of classical Arabic texts. So some of the words that were used to describe black or dark people was akhdar, asmar, aswad, and Adam. So already giving you a bit of a clue of that last one in terms of prophet. So Adam alayhi salam would have been described as black today, and in commentaries on him, it said that when somebody is very dark, so very asmar, they would be called Adam, right? And Musa alayhi salam was another prophet who was not just described as being dark, but extremely dark. Sulaiman alayhi salam is typically described as being dark as well, dark in complexion. And just to go back to Musa alayhi salam, it said when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam saw him, it was said that the way the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam described him was that he resembled, in terms of complexion and skin color, the two darkest tribes of the Arabs. He was that dark. Isa alayhi salam, there's conflicting reports. Some reports say he was light-skinned or white. Some say he was black or dark. So there's conflicting reports, but there is still chains there to say that he was one or the other. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, he comes from the lineage of a black woman, which is Hajar alayhi salam, and she herself was a slave before she married Ibrahim alayhi salam. And so someone may ask, okay, yes, they were dark or they were black, why is this important? Sadly, within the community, there are people who either have a hatred, a dislike, or a prejudice towards those who are black or are dark skinned. And this, for me, sediments the fact that, if one of our prophets, was to stand here today in front of us, would you have had a problem with them? These are people who have led the way and paved the way for us to be able to have our deen today. And it's sad to think that some of these people may have, right? So for me, it sediments the fact that, being, and there's stereotypes around what it means to be black. Some people think, being black means being criminal, or being a thug, or being aggressive, right? But for me, this reorientates all of those stereotypes to say that no, one can be black and righteous, one can be black and a prophet, even. So it really puts those things home for me. Also, if you have any questions during the talk, you can feel free to put your hand up and interrupt. If you have something that's relating to right now, you can wait to the end, inshallah. Yeah, go ahead.
In the story of Moses, Christian Bell represented Moses.
Yeah. Was it Exodus?
Yeah, Exodus.
These are things that happen in I guess what you call it popular culture, and I think this is why I love the wisdom of Islam in terms of it's better not to be depicting prophets because of the things people attach to those meanings in terms of politically and socially. So yeah, as you said, Christian Bale was casted as Moses or Musa alayhi salam, and there are commonly when you look at historical accounts, some of them also describe him as being quite light-skinned. And again, this for me, again, some of these things are in hadiths in terms of what he looked like and how he was. And one thing you'll find is that when you look at the hadith tradition, obviously it's not my area of expertise, and I'm not going to go into it too much. The preservation and the chains is at a much higher level than when you look at historical chains of preserving information. So that's something to bear in mind. So companions, male and female companions. So Ayman, so she, may Allah be pleased with her, was the carer for the Prophet, peace be upon him, after his mother died. And it's said as well, the Prophet, peace be upon him, said that if somebody wanted to marry one of the people of paradise, they'd have married Ayman. That was the level of her character and her piety. Sumayya, who was the wife of Yasir and the mother of Ammar, she was a very resilient and strong woman, and she was described as being very dark again, and also having kinky hair. And her character, as I said, was resilient, and she was strong-willed, to the point where the Prophet ﷺ would call her son, you say son of Sumayya, not his father, but son of your mother, essentially. And she was the first martyr of the Muslims as they were being tortured by the Quraysh. Abu Jahl came along when she was being tortured, and Abu Jahl taunted her and was making fun of her. And her being of the character she had, said, no, I'm not going to take this. And she replied to his taunt in a rebuttal. And he was so embarrassed by this, and he really didn't like it, to the point where he stabbed her violently. And on the spot she was martyred. We have Billau, who's someone who is, I think every Muslim knows that, yeah, Billau is black. So that's one I think which is self-explanatory. But I think one which people don't really know about is Ali ibn Abi Talib. So in many descriptions of him, he's not just described as being dark, but he's described as being extremely dark. And again, when I read this, I was really surprised, because I was like, I've never come across this information before. Why isn't it something that's publicly known? But as I said, many texts have described him as being extremely dark. And he was fundamental in preserving our deen and preserving, protecting the Muslims at the time. And we know he was one of the 4 rightly guided caliphs, and he had a very upstanding character. The book I got this from, by the way, if any of you want to look into it and read it, is I think it's a book by a brother called Ahmad Mubarak and Dawood Walid, centering the black narrative, the story of the early pious Muslims and black Muslim nobles. So please look into that, and it's got all the chains, it's got all the references as well. So the next thing I wanted to go into, after sedimenting the black people and dark people within our tradition, is to look at the ways racism manifests today and what we as Muslims can do about this. And if so, at the end, I'd like to turn into a bit of discussion. I don't want to talk too much for the whole time. I'd actually like to get some of your ideas as well, as I can also learn from all of you. Some of these things I've learned through trial and error, through taking advice. I've been looking at the British context and the American context. And racism, anti-blackness, in fact, it's a global phenomenon that's happening everywhere. So I think everybody would be acquainted with the George Floyd issue that happened over I think it was around end of May, June period. That was something which nobody could ignore, no one could get around. And I think some people struggle to understand how racism can manifest and what it can look like. It can look like, it can manifest in the ways of police brutality, for example, and stop and search is another one. So in London, you're about 7 times more likely, if you're a black man or boy, to be stopped and searched by police. And if you go to areas like Dorset, you're 17 times more likely to be stopped and searched. I myself have been stopped and searched, which was really bizarre to me. I was walking with, I'm a medical student, as was said before. I was with 3 other medical students. Of course, there perhaps is this stereotype of, black people can't really, there's not many doctors, or they're not fit to be doctors or medical students. So I was walking with them, and we were just walking, and then the police officer stopped us and said, we're stopping everybody in the area to search them. So I was like, okay. And then he was searching all of us, and of course we had nothing on us. And then there was a group of white people who were walking past, and they weren't searched. And what I was told is that everybody in the area is being searched, but why haven't you done that when people who don't look like me are coming along? And I think things like that happen really make it hit home. There's another brother, he's black and he's on my course as well. He was on the train, subhanAllah, and he said, when he was talking to me about this, he didn't really, he said he hasn't really talked to anybody about this because he was really traumatized about it. So he was on the train, and because of the case of mistaken identity, or there was something going on in the area, armed police came onto the train and were pointing the gun at him, and he was on the floor. He was scared out of his mind, and he didn't know what was going on. And at the end, they told him, oh, we got your identity wrong. We were looking for a different person, and no help was offered. This is something he's carried with him, and he hasn't been able to talk to anybody about it. So this criminalization of Muslims, of black people, is something that happens commonly. And if you want to look at some more of these issues, there's a website called the Institute of Race Relations. You can go online, it's got loads of stats and figures that you can look into. Another one I think is really important is education. So something that people don't know is that in GCSE, black students actually outperform white students. It's something that's well recorded in statistics. However, when you come to university, you have black students doing on average 27% worse than their white counterparts. And they're coming in with the same grades, So what is it that's happening when they go into university that is creating barriers? It may not be very overt things. It may be subtle things, the way your academics and teachers may be speaking to you. I myself know that when I was trying to do medicine, I was trying to apply, my teachers were saying, oh, we don't really think you're one of the A-star students, or we don't really think you should apply. Look at something else, downgrade yourself. My parents actually had to come in and really speak to the teacher firmly to say that, why are you telling him this? I'd be in the room actually, and the teacher may say to another student, they'd say, he's not good enough to go here and there, but you are, so you can try to a white student. And I'm thinking, I'm right in the room and you're saying this out loud for people to hear. And when I go into schools and I speak to young black people, this is something that is felt by so many of them. And there's another statistic. So a young black child with behavioral issues or learning disabilities is 136 times more likely, I think it is, to be expelled from school than a young white girl in the same school. And this is something, again, these are facts and figures that are freely available. There's an established area of research which shows that there's a pipeline of young black children being expelled from school, being treated more harshly, and so this then sends them down in the pipeline to, once you get expelled, it's hard to find a different school. They get sent to these sort of reform schools, and in these schools there isn't much provisional education or direction for them, and then this then leads to a pipeline of prison. For example, if we go to America over the pond, a black person is one in three black people, black men, will find themselves in prison for life, as opposed to 1 in 17 for white people. So there's all of these kind of things. And I think when we look at the George Floyd issue and the issue of police brutality and inequality and racism, I think what happened was, because I was looking at the way people were responding, and I was kind of confused as to, there have been black people being shot in the UK and in the US countless times. Why is it that this is the one that has made people kind of wake up and see? And I think it's because of the coronavirus. Everybody was on social media or tuning into their televisions. People weren't really working, so they had to be focused on what was going on. Because I sort of watched how these conversations were coming on social media, and it first started off, what is the American government going to do about it? Then it was what a Western government, was the UK government, and then the question somehow went to the Muslim community. What's the Muslim community going to do about this? How is the Muslim community looking at this issue? And there was so many views, people were saying a lot of things. Some of them, there was anger, there was frustration, there was ignorance, there were loads of things clashing. And I think, honestly for me, watching how the community was speaking about this issue, was clashing on this issue, it was quite painful to watch, just because I was saddened the fact that we as believers, we were fighting amongst ourselves. It was a saddening thing to see. And so what I like to do in my work is to provide frameworks and understandings of how can we engage in these spheres and in this type of activism in a way that is Islamically centered and from our principles. One of the most important things this is again from my own experience, I realized was that everything needs to come back. We need to check actions, cultural things, political things, social things, back through the lens of faith. It's very, very important. There are different movements out there which have different things. They have their own solutions that they're trying to advocate for. I've seen Muslims who have jumped on board with these solutions, and because the core principles of those movements or of those solutions are, it's not just that it's not things that they're not things that don't align with Islam, but sometimes things that come into conflict. I've seen those people lose themselves. First of all, it may be internal things, so certain doubts that start coming. Then it becomes more physical things. It becomes the acts of ibadah, and they start to question a lot of these things. And I think I want to be open with all of you here, because a lot of people do ask me this. They ask me, how do you feel about the organisation Black Lives Matter UK and US? And the way I put it is, look, personally, I wouldn't take part in the organisation, and people ask me why. And the reason why is because I know there are aspects of the solutions they're trying to get towards, or I know there are aspects of their politics which don't agree with my faith and they don't agree with my principles. Some people may say that's fine, you can still get involved. You need to be very careful of who you organise from and who you take your solutions and knowledge from. When I speak to a lot of Muslims who perhaps, and again, when I say this, I've seen people join certain movements or join certain causes, again with a righteous cause, they wanted to do something right, and then the solutions or their mindset really starts to come into conflict with Islam, because when your paradigm of justice that you're working towards isn't an Islamically centered one, you then actually start to come into conflict with your own faith, right? I did a workshop on this actually, just how this can manifest and how we can avoid it. And it starts to, I've seen it when I've spoken to people where the solutions that an organization they're part of and they really believe in, and our Islamic principles start to rub, and it starts to tear them apart, and they start feeling like, okay, what should I do? Should I go with this or go with this? And if you're not centered, if you're not, if you're not aware of what you're getting yourself into, it can really rip you apart, and it can have effects on your acts of worship. And as I said, I've seen that in the student political sphere especially. You need to be careful who you're rolling with, who you're moving with, who you're keeping around you. The hadith, a person is on a religion of their friends. It's the same thing when it comes to politics. You tend to be on the politics of your friends. Sometimes they may even question, okay, why do you believe this, or why have you taken this thought to be your own, right? And when I get down to the crux of it, it's because a friend of theirs believes in this, and they don't want to upset them perhaps, or they don't want to offend them by taking on a different belief. But what we need to remember is that, again, coming back to it, our solutions, our beliefs, and the concepts that we embody need to be from an Islamic perspective, and it needs to center Allah first. If you try and work for the betterment of people around you when you're working on these different movements, or getting involved in social justice, or fighting, fighting against racism, right? If you don't put Allah first and you put the people first, you'll start running after what the people want and not what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants. So this is what I said when we're looking at these different identities, Black, British, Muslim, the converging point, the focal point, needs to be the Muslim aspect. And another thing is that when we look at a lot of these movements, again, it may not even be BLM, UK or US, just general movements that don't center Islam within their principles, what you find is that the spiritual aspect, we live in a society now where some people are now waking up to the fact that there is this concept of the soul and the spirit, and these things have effects on our behavior even though we can't see them. But a majority of society is focused on, it's about reputation and money generally, right? Now, a lot of these movements, as I said, a lot of maybe political parties now, right? When you don't center the soul and the effects that the dunya and the things around us have on the soul, and you only focus on reputation, money, or political gains, these things take an effect on you because their solutions and things that they may be advocating for discount the effects that it can have on your akhirah, for example. And for us as Muslims, we know that there is going to be something after that comes after here, right? Whereas for other people who are not believers, everything that they want is right here, right? They want heaven on earth here. That is what they're working towards. And again, working for the eradication of racism, injustice, and unfairness in society is not a bad thing. However, if you're trying to work for a paradise on earth and try to get everything in the dunya, you're not going to be able to get that. There is always going to be some form of injustice as long as humans exist, right? There's always going to be some form. We as Muslims, what our duty is to fight back against that as much as possible. And within the steps that we take, as long as we keep our principles and we keep firm on our principles, if we don't get the end result that we want in this dunya, we will get it in the hereafter. That's the way we need to think. If we keep focusing on short-term goals within this life, we will lose out on the long-term goals of the next life, right? So these are some of the things I think are really, really important to talk about. Again, when it comes to culture, sometimes I do find that some people, they have that conflict between doing something cultural and the religious. Again, it's not to say they're mutually exclusive. There's a lot of overlap. But something I have seen, for example, in the Muslim community is that when it comes to black culture or black people, that side of culture is questioned, and it's like you have to choose. But with any culture, what it should be is that you need to remedy it with our faith, right? You take the good and you leave the bad. And I think social media comes into this a lot, this discussion, just because when it comes to people's views and things they're doing openly in public, right? It's no longer about how much knowledge you have or how wise this is. It's about how many retweets does it have, how many likes, how many shares. And it's a very dangerous era to be in because I find a lot of the people who actually give the best examples of how you should behave in these spheres, a lot of them are either not on social media or they don't have as many followers, so they don't have as much exposure. But we as Muslims, whether you're a black Muslim, black British Muslim, or Muslim in general, we need to be very careful of the information we're consuming. If some of you want to understand a bit more about this, there's the Social Dilemma. There's a documentary on Netflix which talks about your social media usage and how it changes your mindset, how it changes the way your brain works. Every conversation we have, every interaction, every thing we read, article, tweet, these things are going to have an impact on our minds, right? And I often see a lot of Muslims, they'll be reading XYZ book. It may be something that's been set in their curriculum, it may be something at university or at school, it may be something which they found online in terms of an article or a book. When these books are not Islamically centered, that is fine. It's fine to obviously read books that aren't Islamically centered, right? However, what is very, very important is to remember that you as a person, you can be molded in terms of your thought, in terms of what you're consuming. So one thing I think is really important in terms of a practical tip is before and after, or maybe in the morning and the evening, set aside 15 minutes or so to read the Quran, whether it be the English translation, the tafsir, or the Arabic. And this will help reorientate you as you're going into these spheres. Even when you're going outside, even if you're not participating in one group or another, when you're going out and you're consuming different bits of information and different conversations, all this type of knowledge that is out there, you need to be able to reorientate yourself to make sure, because again, it can be a very gradual process of losing your way or losing the focus of why we're all here. Again, we should celebrate our differences, we should recognize our differences. However, the converging point, I'll keep emphasizing it, needs to be Islam, needs to be our faith, needs to be our identity as Muslims. So I'll leave it there actually because I want people to ask questions. A lot more of the content will come from questions, and I want you to add to the discussion. But that was just a short bit on that, inshallah. So that was beneficial, inshallah.